So we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I am Sarah Feldman with the Consortium for Service Innovation. I'm joined today with all of the staff of the consortium. So drop any questions in the chat anytime. You'll have lots of helpers ready to answer questions about anything consortium. And then great KCS experts joining us today as well to talk about all things KCS. We have Jennifer Crippen and Lana from Right Answers here to talk about all of their experience with teaching and helping folks be successful at KCS. This is part of the KCS transformation series. This is our third event of the year. We have one more happening in December for the fourth phase of the adoption guide. If you haven't checked out either of the first two events, I strongly encourage you to do so. I'm actually going to mention it again, the previous events later today when we talk about your questions and challenges that you all submitted when registering for this event. Really quickly, what we're going to cover today is based off of the Build Proficiency phase of the Adoption and Transformation Guide. We're going to do a quick overview of what this phase covers, look at a couple ways to understand the indicators of proficiency, and then spend a lot of time on your questions and challenges. When folks registered, more than 60 of you added a challenge or a question that you wanted to talk about today. So thank you to everyone who submitted things that you wanted to talk about, because it's going to make for a wonderful conversation that's super relevant to you. And really quickly, in case you don't know, the Consortium for Service Innovation, we are a nonprofit organization. Our members own the KCS methodology as a nonprofit. They're the ones that keep it going. And because we are a nonprofit, because we love knowledge sharing, obviously, we get to give away lots of stuff for free, like events like this, because we really just want more and more people to be successful at it. We also do have membership, which is an important part of evolving the methodology, both in terms of the membership dues is the primary source of the funding. So everyone out there benefiting from KCS, it is thanks to our members, and not just their dues, but more importantly, their input and their collaboration. We're constantly evolving the methodology thanks to their input. Let's dig in. Build Proficiency overview. So this phase is really about making use of the great habits that our knowledge workers established in the earlier phases, getting the KCS Council to look at things more holistically, more reflectively, and connecting our great habits and the great outcomes from our good habits to organizational learning for really greater impact and greater improvement across the organization. Within this section of the adoption guide, there's just a few pages. We have them all linked here for you, talking about how we want to begin to leverage the knowledge base that we've been adding to and modifying and improving as we do our work. Really looking at self-service success, the KDA program, expanding our measurement models to reflect the greater business-wide value, and some specific indicators of proficiency to sort of gauge if you know where you are. We don't talk about benchmarks hardly ever in KCS methodology, because it really is about trending against yourself and getting a sense of where you are on an evolution or a maturity spectrum. We also do have a great resource by and for members that's called a field guide for KCS program management, which is a wonderful resource that a bunch of really experienced KCS program managers got together, and it's kind of their playbook for how they think about doing their work. When we look at self-service success, it is mentioned here in the adoption guide, but also more details even in the practices guide linked here. And making the best use of self-service success, our members have identified 5 key enablers to make sure that we're getting all the information out there that our customers need. We talk about findability, completeness, access, navigation, and marketing. Now, I do want to spend an extra minute on completeness and our 90-0 rule here. And this is the idea that I see Jennifer Crippen smiling, because we know how important this is to talk about. The idea that 90% of what we learn during the course of supporting our customers is published to self-service right away, 0 minutes after case closure, basically before case closure. This is super, super important for getting the most out of our KCS programs. One of the things I hear most often that actually unintentionally inhibits folks from getting the most benefit from KCS is they use things like review queues or, insert synonym here for any sort of justifiable, they think, reason to delay content getting put into self-service immediately. We have data that shows that the quickest that the information gets out into self-service from the second of the demand, that's when you're going to have the most need for it. And so any blockers or delays you're putting in the way are likely not necessary, and things that you can mitigate with good knowledge worker training, good coaching, and get out to the customers as soon as possible. I could probably keep talking about this for 20 more minutes, so I'm going to make myself move on, and it might even come up again later. Knowledge domain analysis. So this is the work that gets done to actually get those great insights that we want to use to improve our business. In addition to talking about a KDA program in the Adoption and Transformation Guide, we have an entire guide dedicated to the role of the knowledge domain analysis role. Kelly, I wanted to tag you in here because I think of all of our KCS documentation, I have a hunch that this is maybe one of the more underutilized resources, because we have a lot of folks that ask questions out in the KCS world who we think that their questions would be answered here. Can you say a couple things about this guide?
It exists, and it's a wonderful resource. It really is designed to walk through the things that a knowledge domain expert might do, and is pretty great in terms of laying out what some of those steps might be and some of the actions that a knowledge domain expert might take.
All right, so the KDA guide is great. We're going to spend lots more time today talking about your specific questions, but I do encourage folks to go check that out and see if there's great examples and resources there to talk about doing the KDA work. And the last thing that this section of the transformation guide talks about is, like I've mentioned already, expanding our measures. So we're really looking at driving business outcomes based on article reuse. Here, I'm already going back to my soapbox, why it's so important to get content out to self-service. When we look at this customer demand model, our member data has shown that there's 10x volume in self-service compared to what we see in the assisted channel. So if we're just looking at driving business outcomes based on article reuse from the assisted channel only, we're really missing out on a lot of valuable data. And it's actually the data that reflects the folks that might never submit a support case, but absolutely are reflecting huge opportunities for improvement, both in our content and especially our business processes, and in particular our products. So the quicker you're getting content out to self-service, the quicker you're having meaningful insights from the demand that's being sought in the self-service channel. And we have a great resource, Understanding Success by Channel, that helps folks. It includes a spreadsheet, tons of guidance, lots of like recipes, good, better, best recipes for how to measure the things that matter in your environments, to turn some clouds into real numbers in terms of reflecting what's happening in your environment and how much that knowledge is getting utilized and actually saving the company money, because who doesn't want to do that? I grabbed this quote from this part of the transformation guide because it really does sum it up, that when we're entering this phase of KCS maturity, the contribution of the support organization can no longer be measured solely inside support. The benefits are happening across the organization, and we're doing measurements now to reflect that. Speaking of measurements to reflect that, in the guide, we talk about indicators of proficiency. There's a whole table there with lots of examples and how to know kind of if you're on the right track or not. They are in two type, high level categories. I just grouped these here, where in some cases we're looking at indicators that are telling us about performance and behavior metrics, like how are we doing with the program itself? Are we getting things out to self-service? Are we, as quickly and as often as we should? How is our caseload looking in terms of new versus known? New versus known is a really important indicator to sort of track and trend over time if you're on the right track with moving demand to self-service. And then here, of course, we're looking at the wider and longer range benefits and outcomes, sustainability and capacity of your human resources, your knowledge workers and other folks, customer success, downstream effects of them having better content experiences, better product experiences, and those employee engagement types of things where folks just, you have more interesting work to do. And that's one of the other great benefits that KCS enables. And a great takeaway from this part of the guide is that, why do we start focusing a lot of time and energy on doing knowledge domain analysis? And we're collecting all of this great data. We're doing all of these great things that are unlocking all these benefits. And then we do have to go the extra step of actually grabbing that evidence and showing it to the people that those stakeholders that make important decisions, that we need them aligned with our vision and the benefit of what we're doing. So sharing the evidence with leadership and back to the knowledge workers, can't forget that visibility to impact is what sustains KCS momentum over time. Kelly, did I miss anything important that you want to say in our context setting about this phase?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question, isn't it?
That is.
It's so connected to all the other phases, and as we like to say, the tentacles really run deep.
Love that. Thank you for saying. So great. We have so much time now to talk about everyone else's questions and challenges when it comes to this phase. There's a lot to unpack here. Like I said, more than 60 of you submitted things. We have just a sample here, and I've organized them into some topics that I can't wait to get Jennifer and Lana's take on. Really quick, I'm going to say 2 more things before we dig into it. I'm not trying to tease for too long. First of all, in case you don't know about it, there is a knowledge domain analysis workshop. We're going to talk about lots of great things. We already have many things captured that we share, tons of wisdom that you can find about how to do knowledge domain analysis well, how to make the most of the evolve loop. And it is sometimes a dramatic change, especially for the folks who are doing this type of work for the first time, drawing connections between parts of the business that they haven't done before. And so taking some time, investing a little bit of time and money to focus for a couple days on this phase of KCS adoption with experts. These workshops are taught by experienced certified KCS trainers and partners. Really wonderful use of time to get yourself in motion and on the right track for looking at your environment. This is a custom workshop. There's no like multi-company folks that do this. You just do it just for your organization to look at your processes, your data, how to make the most of what's going on in your environment. Time and money well spent. I might be a little bit biased, but I highly recommend it. And the last thing I want to say before I promise I'm going to turn the mic over to our friends is that amongst the questions that you all submitted, there still were a handful of folks mentioning things that were related to knowledge worker, habit adoption, leadership alignment, communication, some of those more foundational things that are important to get right at the beginning, but it's never too late to revisit those things. And the previous 2 events we've had in this series, I would highly recommend if you have any questions or challenges around adoption, communication, alignment, knowledge worker habits, go back and watch those because tons of great discussion and wisdom was shared in those that can help answer those questions. Okay, let's dive into this part. I have organized, this is our Jeopardy board, except we already have all the answers revealed. All the clues are revealed. Are we evolve looping yet? How do we know if we're doing this or not? Measuring the measuring, we'll dig into. That's an interesting one with some nuance. Self-service questions, we're always looking at how to improve that, and organizational learning. But let's start with, are we evolve looping yet? Lana, Jennifer, how do we know if we're doing it?
You're already doing it. The answer is just plain and simple. I'm sorry to break that glass, but it's true. I think if you're asking yourself, are we doing this evolve loop stuff? Are we doing, are we building our proficiency? Are we starting and interested in doing KDA work? You're already doing it. The evolve loop is really not, in sequence to the solve loop, even though adopting in the solve loop is where you start with KCS. In order to do adoption, you plan and design. You're already kind of in the trenches of the evolve loop by just organizing your program. How are we going to do KCS? What's our tool? How are our tools going to support us? What's our content standard going to be? Who's going to be the first team that we train and coach? Who are our coaches? All of those elements are evolve loop tasks that are building your program, planning and designing your program. So the evolve loop is always going. And as you get started with the solve loop, then they're both going together, right? They're evolving together, if you will. So I think to just bust that myth right out of the gate is helpful. Lana, anything that you'd add to that?
I wanted to say, it sounds like you're talking about double loop
What?
processes. There's two loops going on at the same time. But I think that's where this when to start, this like, what's the trigger? People get a little hung up on it because we're used to thinking of things in that linear way, right? Step one, step two, step three. Whereas when we have our loops going, it's all looping together. We're not waiting for step three to happen before we start reflecting on what's working and what's not, right?
Definitely. And I think in the way that you're laying that out, to add to that is when we get to build proficiency here in this phase, you might still be adopting, but you're already getting ready and needing to kind of get started with KDA, even though you're still adopting KCS. So it's not a gated linear process. It is very likely that your programs, your organizations with KCS transformation are adopting and also building proficiency in like at the same time. And I think that leverages that double loop. It's not linear.
Yeah.
I would love to jump on my soapbox just for a moment about this very topic, which is that I think that we have done a disservice in separating especially knowledge domain analysis activities from the other things that are going on in the KCS system. So one of the conversations that many consortium members have been having is how do we move some of those conversations and specifically some of the organizational learning to earlier in the process. So the argument, I think, is that communicating any kind of win that you get early on in the KCS life cycle really is the foundation of evolve loop or organizational learning or KDA work. So anything that you can say that you are socializing, any of the stories about, I actually just got a question that I was able to answer like that because I found a knowledge article about it. That's really where we start. And so that work starts as soon as you can do it. That's kind of one of the ways to think about how and when we start the evolve loop is whenever we have a story to tell about our success.
Yeah, great.
Oh, I love that. Like Lana mentioned triggers. What's the trigger to know? That's it. You have something good to say.
Yeah.
Don't hold back the compliments, right?
No.
I love that. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next topic. I'm sure we can always take audience questions. By the way, feel free to type into the chat or raise your hand if you want to come off mute and ask a question. Measuring the measuring. This category of submissions perplexed and intrigued me at first until I was able to sort of separate them from other questions about measuring. I was surprised at how many folks, this is just a sample of the types of things I saw where folks were expressing a challenge about justifying doing this work at all, rather than focusing on getting the measures that are going to give us the lessons to improve our business. It's how do we actually measure and track the ROI of KDEs doing KDA, right? Knowledge domain engineers doing knowledge domain analysis, tracking their output and just getting the resources and the time to do it. What do you folks think?
I mean, some thoughts, some experiences on this one, I think is recognizing that for leadership and managers, your investment in KCS includes resources, and that like everything else, there will be dependencies on making sure that you have people in place, human beings in place to sit down and pull the data, analyze the data, put an action plan together, track those actions, complete those actions, and then evaluate the investment. So I think that's often overlooked, like all ROI. I think that's often overlooked for knowledge domain analysis. Is that, oh no, we really actually need to invest in a workshop. We need to learn how to do this and what the best practices are. How do we get started? Because that's a big question. We have to invest time in identifying who the right experts are to participate in this, who would contribute value and benefit themselves from participating in this work. And then measure them successfully. The measuring the successful work being done here, I think, is what is the more difficult part, which is understanding that this isn't just like, hey, go run those reports, go find some opportunities, and then go act on those opportunities. Have at it, everybody, go do it. That'd be nice if it was like that, but in fact, when we're starting to learn how to do something different, we need a little bit more structure to that. And one of those things that, you know, that David and I at DBK and Associates talk about a lot here is just like formalize the plan. Actually have an action plan that you're tracking. You know, we found this article in this report that could benefit from screenshots. Let's put it on the action plan. Let's figure out, am I going to do it? Is Sarah going to do it? Who has time the next couple of weeks? How do we prioritize things on the action plan? And then as you're literally working it, you're completing items. As these items get completed, whether it's improving an article, maybe creating a hub article, maybe it's identifying a pattern around a top issue that you want to request from your product team to have fixed and eliminated so customers stop asking that question. Well, tracking those kinds of opportunities all the way to we submitted a request to product, they accepted it, and now they're actually going to go fix that thing, right? All the way, that's all the evidence Sarah was talking about just a few minutes ago is like, here, let me show you what we did this month, this quarter with KDA work. Here's the opportunities we found. Here's the opportunities we acted on. And here's the value of those actions. And by being able to track that, you can then measure contribution, like KDEs, knowledge managers, content specialists who might be participating in this work, you know, how they're contributing to it because the work is collaborative and being shared. You can then spin all the data around all that work into, you know, value and ROI. It's easy to say when we have a couple of minutes to talk about it here. But I don't mean for it to come off as like, oh, it's easy. You just track all the things and then you go measure it. I think that there's a learning process.
I think there's also, oh, sorry, go for it.
No,
Good.
possible is all I wanted to finish on.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, you know, there's a storytelling element that we were talking about in a meeting on Tuesday about measuring self-service success and how it's kind of the KCS program manager's job to really get that story from, okay, everybody's doing their job and everybody's doing all of the things and I have all of this data. Now I have to then make it into a compelling story to leadership and to all the other folks who are knowledge workers to show them, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And you guys are doing so well and great job. And there's some opportunities here and we're going to start fine tuning those. And we're, you know, seeing all of these improvements because of your work, because of this program, because our KDAs are taking the time to pull this information and make this, make these connections that maybe wouldn't have been happening before. So I think just being able to, I mean, get the information and be able to communicate it in an effective way to leadership, but also having when you're saying, you know, getting resources, this is a good question, right? It always just kind of brings me back to KDEs are part-time role. So identifying what does that part-time role hour-wise look like in your organization? What are people comfortable with? Like, is it 4 hours a month? Is it 8 hours a month? And then, you know, a lot of companies have time tracking where you're able to physically put in, I have 4 hours of KDA work that I'm allotted each month, and I can track that time. And then to Jennifer's point, you can see when they did their items because we've been, working off of a shared collaborative space. And so it all should line up in that way.
Lovely.
Mm.
Great wisdom.
Yeah,
I know we do have
keep it
folks out there who do
Yeah,
so simple,
full
but not.
times are good too. But
Yeah, I know we do have folks who do have one or multiple full-time KDE roles as well. It depends on the size of your org. But
right.
starting with part-time maybe is a great way to prove the value, right? Let's have this expert who's been a participating knowledge worker who has understanding of a domain, can see the bigger picture, and can spend a couple hours a month or a week harnessing some of those insights, making recommendations, making evolve loop content, which we're going to talk about in 1 minute, finding issues to bring to product's attention, right?
Yeah,
that's
if there's the ability to have a full-time one, that's awesome. If you have
Yeah.
the resource and like the need, I think the need is a big one. That's always great. But yeah, I'm not knocking full-time KDEs by any means.
Get it,
It's,
go for it.
yeah.
Yeah, can I? I'd love to add something to that too, because I completely agree. Though getting started with KDA work, like identifying a few knowledge domain experts, starting to practice and learn like some cadence around, maybe every month, every quarter, we're going to run some reports, we're going to look at some data, we're going to identify, right, how this cycle of KDA happens. I think it's kind of learning a little bit of the easy stuff first and practicing that for a few months, getting comfortable, confident doing it. You can do it a little bit faster. And that might be a couple of hours a week for one KDE doing that work. Where as you do it and you get confident and you start to see benefits and you're like, oh, wow, this is really valuable. Then you're like, what else can we do? Like, what other data can we bring in? What other opportunities are we starting to see patterns and trends with? And that might increase from 2 hours a week to 3 or 4 hours a week because now we're learning more, we're seeing the benefit. And I think it's so same. What I mean by that is this is so KCS to think that we kind of start with baby steps and we build some, proficiency. And we build upon that to the point where in some organizations it really makes sense and there's a need to have more of a full-time role in that kind of KDE or those responsibilities. But I don't think any KDA part of your program starts with full-time knowledge domain expert.
Yeah.
Right. So it really is something that, I mean, the build proficiency is profound in how we talk about everything. I think with KCS, it's just like you can't just do all of this at once in order to see value quickly. It takes time. Learning.
I love that so much. And I also really love the idea in terms of thinking about how we might get started with this. Go pull your top 5 articles and then ask one person if they see anything interesting about it, right? Like pull your top 5, take a look at them, see what you see. Is there one friend you could come invite for a different perspective? Like, congratulations, you have created a KDA program. And then you have something to build on, right? Or go look at your top 10 searches. Or, right, we don't have to start with a full sort of slate of where and how am I going to find my full-time KDEs? We can just start with what might I learn? What might I do about it?
I love that. Kelly, you just reminded me of a quick example I can tell from a previous life, several jobs ago for a software company. We did that approach, right? What are our most looked at articles? And literally for years, our top KB article most visited was about an error message that often appeared in the product. And the customer had to go find the clear cache button, and they didn't know how. And so we got hundreds of hits on this article every month. And we had been begging product for years. Like, can you just make it more up? Like when it shows this error message in the product, add a button that says clear cache instead of hiding it. So they have to go on this like merry-go-round to figure out how to fix it. And they didn't. And finally, we just did some math of, well, here's how many people, here's like some quantifying the number of people that see it, the time that they're spending on it, the amount of time that our agents are spending answering this question, what that headcount costs. And we were able to give a relative estimate of the dollar amount this was costing. And the next cycle, they added that button into the product, right? Like we focused on one thing and got an improvement because of it, a measurable improvement that everyone was excited about.
Yeah. Those examples are priceless, Sarah. I think being able to, what you just described very quickly and very effectively is just connecting the dots. When we are able to pull data points together and see patterns and trends, but actually then connect the dots in the data to develop these stories. And then, kind of tapping back into what Lana was saying about storytelling is so much about, what these opportunities are, is just what's the story behind this and why should we be paying attention to it? And, sometimes those stories some of those stories are more important than other stories, and figuring out which ones we should be spending more time on, but I love this.
Wonderful. Let's talk about KDA or Evolve Loop content and beloved self-service. I do want to call out this chat that Ryan shared earlier. So just revisiting like the myth, are we evolve looping yet? Yes, you are. If you're KCSing, you're evolve looping. And Ryan aptly pointed out that he often thinks about evolve loop work and evolve loop content as distinct things. So you're doing evolve loop work basically right away in your foundational elements of your KCS program, but working on evolve loop content, maybe what that looks like for you comes later after some time and maturity and data and practice optimizing content. So that really captures some of the examples I saw in this category of thing of, well, now how are we improving self-service with KCS? Not just capturing the initial knowledge base article, but improving the self-service experience as we go. Along those lines, what does the process look like for making an Evolve Loop article? Do we need different templates? What does that look like? And then how are we really caretaking our self-service experience to continue to improve that? And once again, a little sprinkle of how can we get the resources to do this thing that we already know is important to do. Any thoughts, friends?
I think that this sometimes can be in parallel. It's just I think it's just creating some boundaries and guidelines around solve loop demand versus evolve loop demand for content. And maybe talking about it in a way that can help distinguish that, sure, you probably need some solve loop content to analyze in order to know what gaps need to be filled, or right. So there is an element of needing to focus on solve loop content first and fulfilling that demand. But I think for some organizations, right, that might have a jump start with KCS because maybe they're already pretty knowledge centered. It's just maybe not with KCS specifically yet, or they have some knowledge that's pretty mature, that's evolved, that they need to be analyzing, even though they're maybe just getting started with solve loop. Yeah, this is the loopy thing again. We're back to loopy. It's not in sequence. It's not linear. So there's no hard and fast rule about this for any of you. There's no any one way to do this. So keep an open mind when approaching this. And also thinking about sometimes your resources need to be so dedicated to getting adoption started and building some of that momentum. Your resources just don't have time to be thinking and planning and doing all this evolve loop content stuff. And that's okay too. So, any approach here is probably what works best for you. Don't feel like you're bound by any one way to do it, but also don't try to take on more than what you're capable of doing. Adoption of KCS in the solve loop is critically important to long-term success and transformation, right? And if we're trying to do all the things at once, we may not be supporting the solve loop effort as much as we should be if we're spending time trying to also, trying to do KDA work or evolve loop, content. So just be reasonable about it. That's what I'm thinking about this kind of right now, but that business demand, that, kind of understanding now how customers or self-service users, whether it's members or customers or, end users you might be referring to, how knowledge is being shared and captured and reused and improved in the workflow, but now how are customers absorbing it? How are they consuming it? What's their experience with that knowledge? Is becomes your next priceless moment. Right? You have to do it good internally so that your customers can benefit from the goodness that your teams are benefiting.
I think that's one good element of identifying the health of a particular knowledge domain. And it's an ever-evolving thing. And I put a comment in saying that at Akamai, we kind of have an embarrassment of riches in the sense that we have around 40 KDEs, but they got that role because they're tier 2, tier 3 experts in their particular areas, not because they were proficient in KCS necessarily. So what we are doing is steering the efforts to be led by KDE leads, which we've established as a new role, and they do the never-ending domain analysis, which comes at it from various angles, just like you're talking about, Jennifer. It's not just what we have out there, but how is it resonating? A number of different angles to constantly look at the health of a particular domain, and then sort of quarterback the most impactful work that can be done. Because what's happened with us is we've got 40 people all doing their own thing, and it's just a la carte. Well, I think I'm going to do some content curation. I'm going to do a translation. I'm going to do this and that, regardless of whether or not it was the lowest, juiciest hanging fruit in terms of need.
Love that, Dave. Love that. I think that's really in line with how we in KCS talk about the coaching model. Coaches really benefit as well from kind of having resources that are out there just coaching and then supporting coaches with a coach lead. What you just described is like we have these KDEs that are really experts in the domain area, right? The domain areas, but maybe not experts at KDA work yet. So having a lead to really kind of hone in on those processes and build, that next level of value, and help the experts in the domains have an opportunity probably to learn from those leads. Yes. I mean, to a certain, right? Because they're collaborating in that environment, Dave.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome.
And when you highlight the areas of greatest need and potential impact, there's extra learning on top of it, because it's not just learning A, B, and C. It's learning why A is big right now, then B, and then C. And it kind of fosters this one-pagedness, which we haven't had until recently.
What about the template question? So I know templates are a cornerstone of the solve loop. It really enables our knowledge workers to capture quickly and consistently. Super important. What about evolve loop content? Is it important to have a template dedicated to that, or does evolve loop content take many different forms? Maybe I'm going to lead the witness here. Maybe it's not always an article. Maybe the content that's coming from evolve loop work goes somewhere else in the customer journey. But do we need an evolve loop template?
So I don't think we need a template. We do have to understand how our tool works. So like, how are you creating a resolution path in your tool? That kind of thing. Like you need to understand how your tool works so that you can make like a hub article. How is the linking working? How do we do that? So you need to know technically how to do that and have somewhere documented, hopefully, for how to do that. But as far as like templates go, is I get this question a lot in the practices workshop, right? Where people start wanting to dig really deep into, okay, so what our evolve loop contents look like? And every time we want to start taking an hour away from talking about the practices, I just send a link to the KDA resource on the consortium website because it really breaks it down. And I can't break it down any simpler than that. And having the resource there for when you need it and to reference it, as opposed to me just like saying it in one burst, seems to be really helpful. So as far as like the templates and the processes and like how do we measure self-service, I really like to lean on the consortium created material because it's there and why not?
I love that. And when I said leading the witness, I wasn't trying to lead you to say that our documentation is the best, but obviously it is because it's by our members who have been doing this for 30 years. But yeah, and also that some of the good content suggestions that you might observe from confusion or friction reflected in reuse patterns, right? Where are customers getting up? Where are they getting confused? We want to bring knowledge to our customers at the source as quickly as possible. Very often that is self-service, but occasionally and more valuable, it's actually wherever they're experiencing the problem. Is it somewhere else in onboarding or product experience where your content reuse patterns are showing that there's people are getting stumbling over a phrase or lack of visibility into where how something works that can just be a product suggestion.
Yeah, I with Lana, we experienced the same thing in practices workshops. Is a lot of this just kind of okay? So what evolve loop templates do we need? And I just similarly, I mean, but I'm gonna maybe borrow your technique. It's very smart, actually. It's so smart. But I think this is also kind of going back to the difference between solve loop demand and evolve loop demand is very different before we even start talking about what different templates you might need, is making sure there's clarity around, in the solve loop, we're fulfilling customer and end user demand, and what are those questions and how do we want to structure those knowledge articles for them? Do we have one template, two templates, three templates for that? And if we're then, figuring out what this evolve loop demand is, business demand, results coming out of knowledge domain analysis work that also includes things like new product is being released in a couple of weeks. Do we need a few articles in place for the solve loop to get started? Like, right, talking through the demand and then coming back to the template question. Because I think that can be really helpful in understanding, well, some of those new product release topics are really just a how-to. Just use a how-to article for that. You don't need a separate, template that comes from the evolve loop, like fulfilling that demand and structuring it differently. Pretty often, using what you're using for the solve loop will completely be sufficient for what you're, doing in the evolve loop. To fill content demand. So there's usually more similarities than there are differences, and that's a technique, Lana, that I use as far as like kind of disseminating a little bit like the thought process they're coming in with, and then just kind of breaking it down and then coming back to that question.
Yeah, I love that. It's very sense and respond, right? So are we over engineering something? Because it feels like we're getting at that point. So like maybe let's see if we need it and make it when we need it.
Yep, we got it.
Love that. And I think that theme will carry through to our next and final category of challenges and questions here, which is the organizational learning. How do you what if you have too much data? What a maybe great problem to have, right? We have full-time KDEs and all the data in the world, and where do we go? Where do we start? That was a version of the responses, prioritizing KDA effort. Where do we look? And then a version of, how do we get these changes through all the way to completion with the help of our product team? Another version of this question that I saw was, how do we get the product team to understand our metrics? Which I think that that phrasing is kind of revealing a little bit, maybe where a problem is or a miscommunication is happening. So how do we decide what to do? What's the next best thing to do, guys?
Oh, well, I mean, when it comes to how do we have product understand our metrics, that one's a fun one because it's like, well, what language are they speaking, right? So what are the metrics that they care about? What drives their movement? What drives their manager's movement? Like, let's see kind of what the organization, what's the hot topics? What are the specific words that they're using that are getting responses fast? Use them, right? So even if we call it something specific in our reporting or in our KCS world, we can let that go. It doesn't have to be an Evolve Loop hub article. It can, right? Like it can be whatever it needs to be to get things moving. So I think just making sure that we're approaching and this is for any team really, we're approaching any team with the metrics that are important to them because that's what they're getting measured on. And we're approaching them with the words that they use so that they can absorb what we're saying.
It's storytelling. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think it's just being like, hey, product team, here's all the data that we've generated. So we just assume you're going to know what to do with it. I mean, I think it's taking our data, but creating a story that's relatable for them. And depending on the data as the evidence for that story and the ask that you're asking product for, right? And you're connecting the dots for them and using vocabulary that does resonate, not just, slapping some data up on the screen or, in an email and saying, hey, we got, 1,000 cases about this yesterday. Do something about it. But we got cases, we got knowledge views in self-service. We've got feedback from customers about this issue. And bringing all of that together to build a story. And I love the example of just like kind of putting, like Sarah, that example that you shared about like we put cost associated to all of it so that it wasn't just like here's data and a story, but like let's talk about bottom line and why we think this is really important to us. And I think also that lends itself to all of the points that are asked about here. How do we prioritize certain things over others? What might be costing us more money than compared to other things might be a great way to prioritize some things.
What's our number one views? What are our most views? What will drive customer value is where the prioritization should lie, right? It's kind of
and what might our executives be interested in or talking about? What kind of excellent things can we make connections for them?
I guess
how can we connect the two? Because they might be different things. Like they might not be interested in a cash clear button, to Sarah's example.
Right.
But when they see, oh wow, this has so many interactions and such a ripple effect that we can really change people's experience. Okay, well,
I think actually that to rephrase a lot of what you're saying, and some of the problem might be in the words of this questions, how do we make sense of all the data we have available? Well, you're not going to make sense of all of it.
Right.
You're going to focus on the data that's going to have the biggest impact and that's customer experience stories, and that's bottom line stories with numbers attached to them, right? Like,
yeah,
you gotta pick something. The goal isn't to take all the data and turn it into a story. It's to take the right data and tell the story to make meaningful change.
And to add to that, I would say use resources who are better at data analysis. I mean, if you need to bring in a BI specialist or a data analyst in to kind of help with that part of the skills that are needed to do this work, then that's probably something you should do, because your knowledge domain experts, your domain experts, your subject matter experts, they may not know how to do that kind of data analysis yet, but they really know the knowledge within the domain they are an expert. So it's kind of bringing the skill sets together to build, to build the value. Because we can't just assume, oh, well, you're going to be the subject matter expert in this domain and you're going to start doing this data analysis and finding all this value and all this really great stuff. And they're like, okay, I don't know how to do that. And it's really important to recognize fulfilling some of those upskilling opportunities with staff, bringing in some of the experts to help, including those of us that can help you get started with knowledge domain analysis, right? So don't just assume that as we talk about these resources that everybody's just going to know what to do or how to read the data. It's probably going to take some time in the learning and proficiency development of those resources to practice it.
I love that. Erin, I
Okay.
see your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yep, I just have a response to the point that you raised, Sarah, about too much of data and where do we start and what do we go? What do we do? Essentially, I think that when it comes to the evolve loop aspect, the vision and mission statement of the organization could be the right guiding principle. What is it that they ultimately want to do? And keeping that in mind, the relevant data needs to be just kept in mind, and the not so relevant one can be kept aside for some time. So the vision and mission statement can be a good guiding principle in just finding the way forward.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice. I think we've touched on versions of that throughout, but especially when we're looking at solve loop versus evolve loop. Solve loop, where the demand we're following is coming from our customers, but in the evolve loop, the demand we're following maybe is coming from our organization and working backwards from that way. So looking there, that makes me want to ask Kelly to speak her comment from the chat, which is in a similar idea of revisiting the strategic framework. Kelly, can you share more about why you think this would be a good time to revisit the strategic framework?
We hear from consortium members that perhaps we should rename the strategic framework, because really all we're trying to do is connect what it is we're doing with the KCS with our organizational goals. We're helping people in the organization understand why KCS is important and how it moves us towards the goals that we ostensibly as an organization have agreed to. If what we're looking for is a way to prioritize the things we want to learn from our KCS implementation, and where we might sort of go poking at some of those things, revisiting that strategic framework and looking at the things that the organization has deemed important, and thinking about how we might get some data or some proof that we are moving down that path. That's one way to do it. Much like sort of that external sort of referenceability of a mission or vision statement, this gets a little bit more granular in terms of what it is we're really aiming to do.
That last comment by Arun and what you just said, Kelly, really makes me think that we need one more acronym to add to all this, and that's KDAP, which just rolls off the tongue, and it's knowledge domain analysis paralysis. That's what I'm trying to overcome right now. And I think that really does bring it back to foundation of what we're actually trying to accomplish, which is what the evolve loop should most get us from all of our efforts. You don't have to use an acronym.
We're publishing it right away.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay, we just have a couple minutes left. The rest of this page that everyone will have linked to. Friendly reminder about the KDA workshop, great opportunity, and then just some more wisdom pulled from our adoption and transformation guide about why we're doing things that we're doing in this phase, which we can go see. Does anyone have a final question from the audience while you're here with some experts? Want to give you a chance to get your questions answered? Or any other bits of wisdom from our audience that what has worked for you in your organization? No, putting you all on the spot.
Hey, Sarah, can I share maybe one last
I was going to ask for final thoughts from our esteemed panel next. So yes, please.
I was just thinking about something you were highlighting initially in our session today, which is the 90-0 rule
Go back and look at it. Yes.
for completeness.
Mhm.
And it just made me really think a little bit about, maybe dating myself somewhat here in the KCS community, but remembering when it was 90-90.
Mhm.
90% of articles published out to self-service in 90 minutes is old. It's how it used to be. It's maybe prehistoric KCS than what it is today. And I think that's just a really interesting, highlight around where we've come with all of this knowledge and experience and what the consortium and members have been contributing to KCS and technology getting better to help us do this work faster and, with higher quality and getting better results, that we're actually seeing something like the 90-90 rule change to 90-0 is a great reflection of that maturity of the methodology and all the work that we get to collaborate on together in this community. So I think that's just really fun.
I love that. That's an important reflection. Thank you. Any other final thoughts from Lana or Kelly?
I just appreciate everyone's time, and it's been so fun doing this. Thank you.
And I would just challenge you to take one tiny small step. What can you, what for mankind and your organization? What's one tiny thing you could go do that would be about being curious about learning about what your KCS implementation is telling you?
And
Because
then
that's
you can tell us about
KDA. That's evolve looping.
it is. And then even better, you could tell us about it. Put it on LinkedIn and tag the consortium, or if you're a member, come share it in member Slack. We'd love to hear about your important small wins.
I think
Wonderful.
there's something with Dave and Akamai, what you were talking about as far as like paralysis, KDA paralysis. There's something there worth maybe continuing to have conversations about, Dave. So that was an interesting comment, I thought.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Share some wisdom around that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a
Sarah.
great rest of your day. We'll see you at another event soon.